I'd like to welcome today Louise Locke from Custom Connect, who is recording our fourth podcast for the Unicorns and Dark Horses series. And this podcast will be around how South Africa is redefining global outsourcing. So, Lou, if you wouldn't mind doing a brief introduction, please.
Certainly. Hi, Hannah. It's good to see you again today. And thank you for inviting me to do the podcast on South Africa. I think it tends to be one of those misconceptions and people always go, oh, what's happening down on the Southern Hemisphere? So pleased to be able to talk about that today. So I am Louise, as you said. I currently have a role as the Managing Director for Custom Connect in South Africa. And I have the responsibility of 4 different locations in office, including some of working from home and some offshore capability. So I have quite an interesting development in Custom Connect, and I've been out here now actually 9 months, but my role is about to change a little bit. But in essence, I feel like I'm really getting how the spirit of South Africa is working for outsourcers.
Wonderful, and it's really great to have you with us, Lou. So let's crack on with the questions. So many boards and senior business leaders still see South Africa primarily as a low-cost delivery location. From an operator's perspective, how does that framing actively limit the value companies get?
Well, actually, fundamentally it is a lower cost location. So South Africa does stand up along with the other locations as a delivery site of choice. What I think is missing with that frame is that people tend to assume, because it's a low cost location, that potentially you have low skilled workers and therefore you have a low appetite for people to want to do extra work or different skilled work, or really understand how to support businesses. With the frame again of saying it's just a low cost location, what I think people are limiting is the opportunity to really support their own business so that they can expand. So what I see with many customers who come my direction looking for an outsourcer, the scope of what they have in for moving offshore tends to be quite straightforward. It doesn't tend to be very technical. It can be what we consider to be straightforward, straight through processing. But when you actually look at the skill that's in South Africa and you see someone's business model, you can see where we can add much more value, because the more value we add, especially to UK companies, what that means is that they can expand much further. They can develop what they would like to do onshore. They can develop where their customer base really wants value add from UK-centric customers and suppliers, and at the same time all the back office functions or the mid office functions or even some front end functions can actually be done offshore, especially out of hours. Actually, we're really popular for customers who may want to do 24/7 service, where they don't necessarily want to pay the high rates onshore. And actually the South African workforce is used to working the hours that potentially aren't particularly appetizing for their own workforce onshore. So there's many different ways to actually line up the services that can be done. So I think sometimes just going it's a low cost location may be one facet to your question, Hannah, but actually broadening it out is a very wide remit and skill set that can be applied to support them.
Wonderful. So I don't know, I'm good at kind of growing arms and legs onto these things. So if I'm getting ahead of myself, please do round me back. What about kind of the cultural and educational add-ons there with regards to the value that South Africa can bring?
Well, I have to say let's do education ones first. Having had the opportunity to work here for at least 9 months, as I mentioned before, the educational standard of every single employee is seriously impressive. So not only do people consider their straightforward education, nearly every member of the workforce has at least 2 or 3 degrees, which completely astonishes me based on what we're used to in the workplace. And nearly every single person is continuing to do study outside of work. Now, I should mention, a lot of this isn't supported by a company. This is out of their own back. They're usually paying for their own education. They're doing night schools, advancement skills, self-developing business. There is a train of development and a train of educational appetite that I have to say I have not seen anywhere else. And I've worked in several different locations around the world, and this is significantly impressive. Culturally, however, Hannah, the other thing that's here is the appetite and ambition to want to do a great job. I don't mean just a good job, I mean a great job. The energy that people come to work with to actually do their best every single day, again, is impressive. It's consistent, everybody shows up, they show up to do a great job, they're disappointed if they don't get it quite right, and they absolutely relish feedback to make themselves improve and to drive themselves to be constantly developing. Probably aligns to the educational process as well, but that whole ethos and that whole culture of how it works in South Africa is significantly, it is just impressive. I know I said that a couple of times, but it astonished me. It's every day when I just think I've worked it out, something else amazes me, or something else I think, wow, how did somebody do that? So for example, I have a lady who works in one of my teams. She has a number of different degrees in all different disciplines. She's actually fundamentally trained as a biochemist, believe it or not, but she decided she wanted to have multiple interactions and multiple experiences working across industry, so that when she gets to her more senior job, she has more educational process to pull from and more direct experience to actually make sure that when she's in a leadership role, she can pull from different backgrounds. And I'm looking at this woman who is responsible, if she's got a network of family that she provides for. And I just think it's just amazing how this cultural responsibility relative to an employer and to their own well-being and their family, and how South Africa works and their cultural heritage, how all of these things fit together to make a workforce that are all driven in this way. And I realize I probably sound like being very, very excitable about it, but it's every single person's pretty much the same. And I have the privilege of working with 650 in an office every single day. And everybody shows up for work, and everybody moves with the system, and everybody does their thing. And it's encouraging and re-energizing for lots of disciplines. It would be a great thing if we could work out how to share that energy with what happens in South Africa, to what are the new teams, especially new people in their work environment across the UK. If actually they only spent a week here, I think it would actually put people on a very good grounding and pathway as an idea to get that re-energized in our workforce, because I think it might be missing today, if I'm honest with you, but it's certainly over here in bucket loads.
I love that, and no need to apologise for being passionate about it. I mean, it just shows authenticity behind your answers, doesn't it, really? So that's great. So what is South Africa offering today then that fundamentally moves the outsourcing conversation beyond cost?
Well, I've highlighted a couple of things already, I think, but yeah. Cost is obviously a really important element, right? Most people tend to look at outsourcing, whether you're onshore or offshore, because of the cost factor. So, it is a thing there. But actually, it's how people should be viewing a brand ambassadors of their own product. So you really need people who are engaging with your brand, who are understanding where you want it to go. At Custom Connect, we have the option of saying to somebody, well, actually, I know you're thinking you might want 20 roles outsourced, or a particular product outsourced, or a certain development, or a support, or a time frame, or whatever that combination is. But actually, South Africa has the opportunity, because of the scope of products we work with, to be able to say, well, actually, you'd like to do it this way, but if you were doing some organizational redesign, and I know, Hannah, you do a lot of that work as well with companies to say, actually, is there another way to do it? If you work with outsourcers and you work with people in South Africa, they are used to so many different facets to say, actually, there is another way to do that particular function. So if I give an example, there was somebody I was talking to fairly recently who was looking for what they thought were 3 different roles based on their current design. And by the time I'd finished talking with them, it turned out to be a completely different model they needed to work with, which may not have the same cost profile they were looking for. In actual fact, in that example, it was significantly less, because it's just like, well, let's just work with this a different way. Let's look with the products you've got. Let's work how you're doing the marketing. Let's work on how we can do the sales process. And it's just understanding that. And outsourcers are used to having those conversations. I think historically, using my own experience, I think what we tend to do when we work with outsourcers is think we already have to have it mapped out with what we want, how big we want the team to be, what we want the process to be. But actually, sometimes some of the best conversations I've had as a supplier of outsourcing is to say, tell me where you want to go, tell me why you want it to be in that particular direction, and then build the operating model on the other side of it. Very different way to look at processes. So I think when you're working with outsourcers, especially in South Africa, due to the experience of it, due to the language, which is very common language to understand, with the timeframes, it's easy to do work with, but also have I don't really know where I want to go with this, but help me type of conversation. I think you'll find there's a richness in there which you may not be expecting, which actually helps you to solidify your operating models.
So, a really kind of dynamic offering ultimately. Absolutely. And, I picked up there the real kind of value add for clients. I mean, traditionally, but perhaps outsourcers could be guilty of just trying to sell more seats. Whereas what you do by working backwards is, I mean, you, as you've just clearly said there, the client prospects actually didn't need as much work outsourcing after, consulting with you. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much. So some executives still assume South Africa can't handle complex, regulated or mission critical work. What are you seeing that may challenge this assumption?
I can understand when that is a view. I think it's some of the other questions you've asked as well, because of the reputation I think outsourcers generally have. We tend to assume it's straightforward, quite basic, quite straight through work. I currently deal with a number of clients where the work is complex, all the way through to digital coding, website design, as well as what I would consider to be standard service. The thing, however, which I think people need to remember is a really, really skilled workforce in South Africa. How you choose to put your roles to market or put your work to the marketplace, like we just discussed a second ago, will then design by default the type of individual and the type of skill set you're looking for. I always focus heavily on people's skill set, and it's how to get that skill associated to that role. So there is a significant amount of availability and people who are passionate and hungry to be able to demonstrate what they can do. I think that's the best way to say that, right? So we've got everything from copywriters all the way down to legal services and everything in between. So I would encourage everyone to consider, as you mentioned a second ago, where is it you want to get to? How do you want to make that a viable product for you, especially if you're onshore in the UK? How do you want to make your business grow? How do you engage consultation with that design factor, and then work out what skill you need, and then decide whether it's something you think you have to keep onshore because it might be critical to your customer base, or something you can explore offshore because there are enough people in this particular hemisphere who can do a similar work. It's all about that conversation. It's all about the transparency of the business model and the business direction, and then to say, this is where we want to go. How do you put that together? It does help, I think, I know we mentioned it a second ago as well, but it does help to go, what is that organizational design need to be? How does that then map out to where you can get that work from? And then decide what it is you need to put that together. You have to work closely with your organizational partner. You have to work closely with your outsourcer. You need to have the same culture fit. I think that's a very, very important thing. So if you're a very dynamic organization, you need to work with a dynamic outsourcer, somebody who flexes and talks to you, and you're both understanding the same common language of your business direction. So many examples I've seen where you might have a smaller company who's gone to a really big outsourcer.
Mm-hmm.
They might think that's good, basically on that security, but they'll get lost, and you won't necessarily have your culture embedded into them. You'll end up taking on their culture, which may not be what you want. And likewise, you may have a really small outsourcer where your work is just not their sweet spot. So it's very important to do your homework, very important to connect with your outsourcer, feel comfortable having those conversations, and it will take your relationship significantly further. It just will, but it's very important to have that that ethos and energy where you actually all think you can solve the problem together. Very, very important factor when choosing somebody to work with.
Yeah, I get it, and I mean, these podcasts are in no way an attempt to plug my own capability and ethos, but you could hear it coming.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, but I mean, in order to be successful, you don't take on work which that you can't fulfill, and it is about having those open and honest conversations at the outset, and it's that openness and honesty that can be missing in those initial conversations, isn't it? So I get it completely. That's great. So the last question then, Lou. So what's the real comparison that buyers should be making today with regards to on or offshore locations, and indeed which outsourcing partner to work with?
Yeah, just a really, really good question, and it's probably the one that I get asked quite a lot. Your on or offshore discussion and decision invariably is driven by your company directive, I would say. So many companies actually can't offshore. Many companies can outsource, but only outsource onshore. And there are some really, really good onshore companies. And you tend to see this with potentially government contracts, or where data is restricted, or certain products where you actually need to be close to the market as a choice. Or it just might be one of your customer directions. I think we'll always remember the examples of the banks who offshored probably 20 years ago, and then they brought it all back onshore again. Do you remember it went off, then it came back? And so there'll always be an option. I would encourage everyone, though, to make sure, especially if you're a smaller company, really make sure that you're getting the right value from the staff you have. And if you have the opportunity to outsource, even if it is onshore, then there'll always be scalability in that for you, and potentially that's a good business decision. If you're not restricted by onshore, though, I would consider offshoring. Offshoring gives you the flexibility to upscale your team and to downsize as and when your markets go up and down. So if you're in the retail industry, you're in commercial seasonal products, like holiday campaigns, for example, or you have a product you sell for Christmas, or you do something else you do for Black Fridays and things like that, your flexibility to upscale very, very quickly and downscale will always be more flexible offshore than onshore, purely because of the labour laws and because of this pure accessibility of people. I would say South Africa has one thing: they have lots of people who can do lots of work. So if you're always in a flexible marketplace, it's always better, in my opinion, to offshore. It also gives you that space. So I was talking to somebody the other day who was redesigning their internal operating model, but they didn't want to stop their customer service. So the best thing they were planning on doing was offshoring, even if it's only for 3 months or for 6 months, to be able to give them breathing space to work on transitioning and transforming their model without letting down their customer service delivery, putting that offshore whilst they work through that, and then bringing it back in. So using that example, if you're looking for a short-term solution to things, while it gives you that flexibility to adapt and to remodel, maybe you're rehiring, maybe you're doing something else, then that is a really good way, again, to offshore. And I say offshore deliberately in that example, Hannah, because what you'll find, and if I use my company as example, because we already have so many people in the mix, we can stand people up for short-term projects, and then we can stand them back down again without necessarily having that giant overhead or that giant risk of skill. Whereas onshore tend to have a different limitation, again, down to our UK labour laws, for example. So people use offshoring in different type of dimensions. But I would suggest that everyone, regardless of the size of their company, should really look at the opportunity to outsource, then decide where you need that to be, rather than go, should we move it offshore first? That's probably the second decision. The first decision is, how do you unpick what you have to make your staff, where you're paying directly, the most efficient for you and the most value for you? Work out what becomes like potentially something that you can use other people to help you with, to give you the freedom to expand, the freedom to be successful, and the freedom to do what you want to do in your business plan in the first place. That is when you should consider how to outsource.
Very, very interesting. And, you know, I'm also really interested in, you know, the longer kind of strategic movements of businesses. And I found that whole offshoring piece, outsourcing, offshoring piece, and then onshoring really interesting. But now we're going back the other way again, for fairly obvious reasons, and we don't need to turn this into a political conversation, do we? Yeah, that's brilliant. You know, thank you for sharing your hands-on and more kind of strategic opinions with us for South Africa as a region. That's very interesting, Lou. Thank you.
Very welcome. Lovely to see you, Anna.
And you too. Take care.
Okay.